Hello, everyone. My name is Oliver, and today I'll be providing you with a summary of all of our work on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022. This output was produced by Courtney, Mollica, Jackson, and myself, and I would like to extend a warm thank you to the whole team, as well as our faculty advisor, Professor Palmer. First, we will be talking about the problem of biodiversity loss, as well as the state of the legislation. Then we will dive into our program design and take a look at the three subsections of our program design, that is the state grants, the innovation grants, as well as an oversight component. At the end of the presentation, we'll take a look at a quick implementation timeline, and I will leave you with some concluding thoughts. Biodiversity loss is a global issue, and it's something that has been accelerating over recent decades. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the IUCN Red List, and the IUCN Red List is a measure of the total amount of endangered species globally, and this number has been rising dramatically over recent decades. Now, the number of endangered species isn't the only metric we can look at to look at biodiversity loss. Another metric we can consider is total population sizes. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the total bird population for the United States. And that number was estimated to be 10 billion in the year 1970. By 2017, that number had fallen by 3 billion. And from that study, we know that it wasn't just the endangered species being affected. Population decline affected species across the spectrum. Now, let's take a look at a species that was particularly impacted by some of these trends. This here is the Carolina northern flying squirrel. And the flying squirrel was listed on the endangered species list in 1985. And it can be found in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Its population decline was can primarily be attributed to habitat loss that occurred due to logging, as well as subsequent forest fires. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what do I care about this squirrel? We've got plenty of squirrels here in New York. However, that would be overly simplistic, and that's because the flying squirrel is essential to the old-growth forests that it lives in. And through its contributions to that ecosystem, it helps prevent floods, soil erosion, and supports a whole list of other benefits that old-growth forests provide to us humans. Now, as an added benefit, the flying squirrel also distributes truffle spores, and that makes it essential to the truffle industry in North Carolina. Now, issues that are faced by species just like the flying squirrel are exactly the kind of problems that the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is trying to address. This act provides an additional $1.6 billion in annual conservation funding, and the act has three titles. Title I amends and provides additional funding for the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Act of 1937. Title II provides additional funding to tribes for them to spend on conservation, and Title III provides funding for species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Our program design will be focusing entirely on Title I, and that's because that's where the bulk of the funding is, and that's also the part of the bill that allows for the most flexibility in terms of program design. Now, this bill isn't some academic experiment. This is a real bill that passed the House with bipartisan support. And it was introduced to the Senate recently. However, at the moment, there has been no vote scheduled. Now, admittedly, its prospects looked a bit better a few months ago. However, when we spoke to people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they told us that they already shifted considerable resources to the passing of this bill. So that gives you some sense that at least the government agencies think that there's a reasonable chance that this bill will pass. Now, let's move on to our program design. Title I of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act provides an additional $1.3 billion in annual conservation funding. 90% of that funding will be going to the state grants, which are a set of formula-based grants that are paid directly to the states for them to spend on a whole range of conservation projects. The other 10% go to innovation grants, which are a set of grants that are allocated through a competitive allocation program or process and are given to innovative conservation projects. Now, responsible for the state grants is the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of the Interior will be supported for this process by an office at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that we are calling the Wildlife Conservation and Restoration Program. The innovation grants will be distributed by a review committee that is set by the legislation, and which will be supported by another office at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the Office of Innovation Grants. Both of these offices are supported in terms of oversight and auditing by an oversight committee. Now, let's take a closer look at the state grants. The state grants are distributed by the Wildlife Conservation and Restoration Program, which will be staffed by 7 members. They will have 1 supervisor, 5 grant associates, and an administrative officer, and together they will distribute $1.2 billion in annual funding with an administrative budget of $1.8 million. The goals for this office are that they're able to distribute all those funds by the end of the year, and also they will be subject to a financial audit. So let's take a look at a species that could be impacted by these state grants. This here is the Houston toad, and the Houston toad is a species that was listed on the endangered species list in the 1970s, and its population decline is primarily attributable to land use changes that happened in and around the Houston region in Texas. Now today, the Houston toad is still endangered, and that's because it has been consistently underfunded. Now, that's exactly where the state grants would come in. The state grants would provide states like Texas additional funding that they could spend on species just like the Houston toad. Let's move on to the innovation grants. The distribution of the innovation grants is supported by the Office of Innovation Grants at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This office will have 1 supervisor, 3 data analysts, 2 administrative officers, and a communications officer, and they will distribute $130 million in annual funding with an administrative budget of $2.6 million. The key metrics of success for this office are the number of applications that they're able to draw in, as well as the number of grants that they are able to distribute by the end of the year, as well as how successful those grants are in terms of their overall and long-term conservation impact. Now, these here are black-footed ferrets, and black-footed ferrets are a species that could be particularly impacted by these innovation grants. And that's because in the 1980s, black-footed ferrets were actually thought to be completely extinct. They found a few specimens out in the wild and used those to repopulate the species. However, one problem remained, and that was that the genetic diversity among black-footed ferrets was incredibly low. So what researchers did who were working on this project was they took some frozen tissue that they had from a zoo and used it to clone a black-footed ferret. And they're now hoping that that clone will be able to induce more genetic diversity into the black-footed ferret population. And cloning, as it was used in the case of black-footed ferrets, is exactly where the innovation grants could be helpful, because the innovation grants would be supporting innovative approaches to conservation as cloning was used in this case. Let's move on to oversight. The Oversight Committee will support both the state grants as well as the innovation grants in terms of oversight, and they'll be staffed by 2 supervisors and 6 support staff, and they'll have an administrative budget of $1.6 million. The goals for this office will be the metrics will be the number of grants that they are able to audit within a year, as well as that the audits are completed on an end-of-year timeline. Let's move on to the final part of this presentation, the implementation and conclusion. So the key goals for the first year are really that the state grants and the innovation grants can be fully distributed by the end of the year. The Oversight Committee will be operating on a slightly different timeline. For them, it's important to establish an auditing protocol in the first year so that they can commence with the auditing in the second year. Now let's come back to the northern flying squirrel from the beginning of this presentation. The state grants will be able to help the flying squirrel by providing additional funding, and the innovation grants will be able to fund innovative approaches to conservation. For example, they could fund new mammal tracking technologies that would make the conservation of species like the flying squirrel easier. Now, as all this additional funding comes in, hopefully the population of species like the flying squirrel will be able to increase, and as that population increases, so will the contributions of the species to its ecosystem. And that's good news for us humans, because we depend on these ecosystems. And what I just said isn't just true for the flying squirrel, it's true for all the species that will be impacted by the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Now, on to our concluding thoughts. By studying this bill and talking to people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we learned that planning for the U.S. government requires many special considerations. Throughout the semester, we also learned over and over again that what gets measured gets done, which is why we decided to make oversight an important component of our program design. By studying this bill and the underlying problem, we also learned that biodiversity decline is a really complex issue, and it's something that requires a large amount of funding over a very long period of time to properly address. We also cemented our belief that it's better to act early than to wait for species to be on the brink of extinction. And most importantly, we learned that species recovery has long-term benefits to ecosystem function as well as human flourishing more broadly. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Awesome job, Oliver. I'm curious, what are the metrics you're thinking of for the innovation grant funding? I think one of the things was the success of the grants. So how would you potentially measure success?
Yeah, so I think when we're measuring success for the innovation grants, we're talking about scientific metrics. So the distribution will be done by a review committee, which will be supported by a set of academic scientists, which will provide them with guidance. But in terms of their long-term impact, I think you would be looking at how well the particular project affects the species that is being impacted. For example, like if we're looking at mammal tracking technologies for a species like the flying squirrel, you'd want to look at how well it works for the flying squirrel. But because these grants aren't meant to be just targeted at one species, you also want to see how well that works for other species. So maybe you would also look at the kind of spillovers that these projects have and whether they are actually able to improve other projects as well.